Hello everyone. It's very nice to be here with you all. My name is Christy Mansfield. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SEER Data Analytics, and it's such a pleasure for me to welcome to the panel today Dr. Ian Opperman, who is in Sydney, and the rest of the panel here today, Stefan and Vicky and myself, are dialing in from New York City. And so I'd like to also wish everyone a happy International Women's Day from New York today. So why don't we get started? And I'd just like to firstly perhaps talk about AI localism. It's a very important topic because what we're learning is how important it is for local people and local policymakers to have agency around the data that they have and the information that they're seeking to make better decisions in their community. So first, Ian, you're the Chief Data Scientist of New South Wales, and you've done a lot of work around the New South Wales AI framework and strategy. Before we get into that, Ian, could you share with us a little bit about data sharing? To what degree is data being shared, and what's happening in that regard right now?
Thanks, Christy. It is still a very substantial challenge getting people to share data. I can speak mostly from the perspective of government. Over the years, broadly speaking, we've tried to address the unwilling, the unable, the not allowed aspect of data sharing. And I think we've come a long way in the last few years. The unwilling has certainly changed. There have been some really great steps taken at both the state, Commonwealth, and even local government level to increase the willingness to share. People during COVID really got it. It's really got the value of data, got the value of analytics. The not allowed part is also being addressed. New South Wales has a data sharing act, which is about to be reconsidered after 6 years of operation. And the Commonwealth recently announced the intergovernmental agreement on data sharing. So the not allowed is certainly changing as well. The unable bit, the bit in the middle, the unwilling, unable, not allowed, that's the bit we still need to work on. And by that, it really is the templates for data sharing. This is the sort of data I've got. This is how much personal information is in it. This is how sensitive it is. This is how sensitive the uses are. Creating those, if you like, drop-down frameworks of template 1, template 2, template 3 for data sharing, depending on the context, the authorizing framework, aspects about data quality. The good news is we're really starting to get our arms around what the issues are and what those sensitivities are and issues around privacy. The bad news is that we still have some way to go, but I think the world has changed a great deal in the last couple of years in particular. And I think this year we'll make great progress on data sharing because we're starting to build those frameworks to make it happen. So good news for 2022.
It does feel like it's a watershed moment, Ian, after so many years of effort and focus to try to facilitate data access and that data flow. Can you share with me, to what degree do you think then that is going to be available to all actors, all stakeholders in the ecosystem at a local level? And you know very well, because we get to work together closely, that our passion is about sharing data into communities for all people to participate in decision-making that makes sense for them, really driving that community-led decision-making. In Australia, of course, you've spoken about opening up those pipelines of data sharing across government. When are we going to see, data shared with all people, that true notion of data democratization?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. That is ultimately, of course, the goal. Sharing data appropriately with people who need it for a range of different purposes in a way which respects the sensitivities and sensibilities of data sharing really is the ultimate goal. My focus for the last 6 years now has been within government. Increasingly, though, the focus is across jurisdictional boundaries, and that means with state and Commonwealth and local government. As you must be aware, I've also been working with the international standards community to try and develop a data usage standard, which actually speaks to all aspects of data usage. So the issue ultimately is building in place frameworks which appropriately use and share data, demonstrate trustworthiness about use of data across its entire life cycle, and ultimately ensure that we're doing things in a way which is beneficial for the people who are actually identified or in fact present in the data. So we've been eating away at this elephant for quite a long time. There's still quite a bit of the elephant to go, but we've identified the trunk, we've identified the leg, we've identified the tail, and we are building the frameworks that help us work towards the center of this elephant. This analogy may not be the best in the world, but again, I think this year is going to be quite a substantial year. Building those frameworks where we can demonstrate appropriate and trustworthy use of data, and also, as I said, putting our arms around really what the issues are, and ultimately helping people not only identify what ways to mitigate those concerns, but also ways of sharing data back with people who are actually present in the data itself. We've learned a lot technically, we've learned a lot culturally, and I think we've learned a lot about the role that data custodians play, the role that data requesters play, the role of people who are asking questions of the data also play. So I think really, I honestly think 2022 is going to be a great year.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. And thank you so much for the questions that are coming through. I can see on the comments, and I apologize for the audio, everyone. So thank you for persevering with us. Stefan, look, I've got some questions around security and data, security and privacy that are coming through. And Stefan, I mean, essentially, it would be really interesting to hear from you, since you have been working on global governance frameworks for quite a number of years. I mean, this is your area of expertise and focus. And you and your colleague, Mona Sloan, coined the term AI localism. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant when you coined that term? What is it? And how can AI be used responsibly to benefit society in this way?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christy, and thanks for also jumping in here as the anchor of the event. I'm sure Steve will eventually chime in again. We coined AI localism as a result of being inspired by what we saw happening under the rubric of new localism, where we saw that cities are not just becoming hotbeds of new ideas about solving 21st century problems, but also labs of innovation as it relates to policies, especially as it relates to, for instance, technologies or data for that matter. And so what we saw happening was that cities are actually more and more, and I'm not talking just about cities, also states and regions, are more and more at the forefront of actually responding to concerns, but also opportunities as it relates to AI. And they are quite often stepping in, mainly as a result of the absence of any national or even supranational or global kind of framework. And so cities quite often have to step in because of the concerns that are being raised and the opportunities that might be missed if there is no trust in how AI is being used. And so we coined the term AI localism to really identify and describe an emerging movement that quite often is not mapped, because if you look at all the discussions about AI policies, AI governance, they always focus on the national level. OECD has an observatory around AI policy, AI governance, and it's all about national policies. But what's really interesting, and where the activity actually is really high, is at the local level. And so we see many manifestations, Christy, of what we call AI localism. And it starts at the level of principles. And so many cities are actually developing principles to guide the applications of AI. And we've seen this, for instance, in Montreal, here in Canada, where they actually have a set of principles that steers the use of AI in a more equitable and inclusive way. We also have seen it in cities like London that recently have adopted a charter that can steer the application of AI and digital in general as well. In addition to principles, AI localism also refers to new types of engagements with citizens around the use of AI. And so we've seen many cities having consultations with citizens in order to co-design the framework in which AI can be applied, but also engagement with local universities, meaning quite often what we see at city level is that they're tapping into expertise that is available at the local level in order to figure out what is the framework that is fit for purpose. And so that's another manifestation of AI localism. Other manifestations are related to new ways of providing transparency. So cities like Amsterdam and Helsinki have now come up with a transparency portal that indicates how algorithms are being used within the city, and that shows, anyway, which city department are actually leveraging algorithms and in what way for what purpose. And that, again, is an important contribution to establishing trust in how it is being used. We also see new functions, like, for instance, the city of New York has now a dedicated algorithmic decision policy officer that is in charge of actually overseeing how algorithms and AI is used. And so I'm going to stop here, and Christy might get back in time. You disappeared there for a second. I'm going to stop here just to indicate, Christy, that there's a lot of innovation and activity happening at cities. Still, we, anyway, managed to describe it AI localism. It was very hard to even have a kind of a vocabulary to describe it. And so that's why we launched this initiative and also launched the term as well.
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks, Christy, for taking over once I think it's now sorted, and if everybody can hear me all right. I'm happy to take over from now, and the next question I would like to go for Vicky. So New York is pioneering the responsible use of AI at the local level, but we are seeing this beyond New York. Could you share with us some importance of AI governance as an ESG consideration for investors, and what you're seeing across the globe?
Sure, very happy to. And just for my caveat before I speak, I am not a data scientist or an AI expert, and I won't pretend to be, but I do know a few things about impact investing and ESG considerations. So it's from this lens that I actually look at AI and what I like to call, the future possible or the unintended consequences of technology, and what that means for society. So just a little bit of background about how, some of us investors are thinking about this is, we're currently in the fourth industrial revolution, and what was once science fiction is now becoming a very real future possible. And so, if we think about it in the context of something quite relevant today, given everything that's happening in Ukraine and in Russia, we are now in the midst of a sixth military revolution. And so, if you look at the thought experiments that are happening about what does the seventh generation of the military revolution look like, AI is really at that center. And there's been heaps of studies, thought experiments sort of around this. And so, when we think about it, I guess what we're sort of, trying to position ourselves for, or in consideration of environmental and social governance factors, we are now looking at this new era, and we're trying to understand what technological breakthroughs are out there within robotics, within cognitive sciences, within AI, and how can this actually translate. And I guess from a venture capital perspective, or from an investment perspective, what are the unintended consequences that we could be potentially funding? And so having an idea, or at least some foresight into what the future of technologies could be and their potential misuse by nefarious actors, is how we like to look at our risk considerations. And, I guess sort of answering that question in sort of like a summary, it's really important for us to be considering these governance issues today, because it will affect materiality, or will affect what we consider risk return factors for the long term for our investors. But also it will affect the positive and negative outcomes that are being created by the portfolio. So it's a completely different lens, but that's sort of how I guess the ESG impact investment community is thinking about technologies like AI.
Thanks, Vicky. And I'm also not an AI expert. I played a little bit with Excel and Python in my time. So yeah, we're always learning, and that's great. So for the next question, I would like to know more about what we are seeing within the communities. Is that they can be hesitant about privacy and some biases when it comes to data sharing. What are your thoughts on this, and how can we make sure that the data that is being shared is for good? So Ian, I would like to start with you. Recently, Australian data strategy was unveiled, and which is to create a national ecosystem of data that is accessible and relevant, and able to be easily used and shared. Could you, tell us a little bit more about how you're ensuring the responsible use of AI?
Sure. So we touched on this just a little bit, Steve, while you were in another land. But there's been a very substantial cultural change in Australia. So I mentioned earlier that the Intergovernmental Agreement on Data Sharing was announced with the Commonwealth and the states during the earlier parts of 2021. And during the pandemic, everyone wanted data to understand the impact of the health restrictions, the impact of the different lockdowns on the economy, on people, on mental health, and a whole range of different things. So the value of data suddenly materialized in front of people's eyes. People suddenly got it. And so that the willingness or desire to access data certainly went up a great deal. The Intergovernmental Agreement on Data Sharing and the associated data strategies of both the state, New South Wales state, and the Commonwealth also started to bring some structure, and again had that big cultural push that it's the thing to do to share data. The challenge, of course, remains the governance around the use of data, and certainly during the height of the pandemic, what everyone wanted is data, but we also needed to make sure we doubled down on the governance structures to ensure that whilst all this data was flowing, it was flowing for the right reasons, to the right people, and not essentially just being allowed to go anywhere. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the governance. And in the New South Wales data strategy, interestingly, we released our AI, artificial intelligence strategy, in 2020, our Smart City, Smart Places strategy 2020, but our data strategy was not until last year. And that may seem a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, but we decided that the data strategy is the really big one. That's the big game still, because AI and smart cities and smart places are really uses of data in some respect. So we spent quite a lot of time thinking through what the data strategy looks like, and then trying to build those frameworks of data sharing, which embed the best practices we learnt during COVID about the speed of data movement, about the timeliness, some of the V's back in the days we talked about big data, the volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and so on, but within a framework of governance that said this is the right way to treat this sort of data for this sort of recipient and this sort of framing. Now, having said that, we've also now brought to life our artificial intelligence strategy. So released a year earlier than the data strategy. It was only last year that we released an AI assurance framework that helps us really see the data lifecycle from the point where we're about to use it for AI. But it does require us to look backwards in that data lifecycle, which reflects all the conditions, the provenance, the authorizing framework to get to the point where we're about to use the data for AI. Is it fit for purpose? Do we have the right to use it? Is it of the right data quality? And then looks forward to the consequences of use of that AI insight or decision or action. And so we've tried to take a holistic perspective on how we use data and data governance all the way through the data lifecycle, and put that in a now very different cultural context of people really wanting to use data and providing the guidance of, is it fit for purpose? Do we have the authorizing frameworks? What are the guidance and restrictions we can put on the use of either analysis or AI decision or insight or action to ensure that we are doing the appropriate thing with the data for the net benefit of individual citizens?
Thanks, Ian. I kind of witnessed how New South Wales government is doing an amazing job, and kudos to you and your team and the whole New South Wales government team that are working on these initiatives and pioneering in Australia. Christy, from the moderator to the panel, back to the panelists, you have worked with communities, and you are still working with communities. How are you ensuring that at Seer data is being shared for good, and how you build the community trust?
Thanks, Steve, and thank you for the question around trust, because I think it's a really fundamental one. We've been working for many years, up to 5 years, really working on the ground with people to understand how they can best utilize data to answer the questions that matter for them. And as Ian pointed out earlier, I think we really are at a moment in time where data access is being solved or has been solved. So Ian spoke about sharing, and our platform, we facilitate sharing from multiple different partners on the ground, whether it's not-for-profits, local councils, organizations that are working to gather data or share data, and then we intermediate data sharing between government agencies and others. So the data access problem has been solved. What's very interesting about this moment, though, and it really goes to Ian's AI assurance framework, where in that framework, the New South Wales government has outlined the importance of co-design. And this comes to the other part of the question, which is question equity. Who gets to ask the questions of the data now that it is accessible and available? And the important thing that we're doing is to facilitate communities in being able to ask those questions. And certainly Stefan has led so much of this work around the world with the GovLabs initiatives. However, what I would say is that is really important is this is not a solved problem, making sure that all people are involved in question science. On the ground in local communities in Australia or around the world to build data literacy and capability to understand what an asset is and how to ask questions of that data that matter to people. And the reason why there is a trust deficit, and I just want to raise this, I mean, the last research that I saw, and I know it has increased in the last since COVID, but only 1 in 4 Australians have trust in governments to make best use of their data. And how to address that? It is a really big issue, because if we see data and AI as a tool that can deliver public benefit, then we really have to build trust. And the way to build trust is, to follow the frameworks and the outline that has been created by governments, and certainly to understand what we need to be doing. But more than that, building that capability and ensuring that people are actually driving the questions for which AI will be used, whether that is questions that matter to local communities, businesses, or others. That will really help us start to build trust, as well as data literacy across the entire ecosystem.
Thanks, Christy. I mean, it's very important to bring along all the stakeholders, and public is the biggest stakeholders for any government. So definitely education and making sure that everybody is aware of the benefits and all the different implications of use of data is super important. So apart from building the trust with the community, we would like to hear more about tangible projects, or hear about the use cases that you might have been seeing or been involved, and what are the outcomes of that. So Wiki, working in the impact investment artisan, is there any use case that you've been involved or seen before?
Yeah, no, I think I'll leave my panelists to give you guys tangible examples of use cases within a localized context. But what I can provide is, I guess, a little bit of background about how we see the use case playing out from a markets perspective or from an investment perspective. And so, just some examples of things that we've seen. If you sort of pull conjecture cards out and actually look at AI and where they could be manifesting within a portfolio, looking at, the generation of and detecting fake media, and wondering and seeing how that impacts politics, and what does that mean for an investment in something in that category. we looked at things like, virtual command advisory, right? So if you've actually got operational commanders in real time, particularly in human-like, reasoning, and this is also, building on that defense, defense, I guess, in some ways, considering AI as a weapon, particularly with all the cybersecurity stuff that's discussions that are happening right now with all of the with the crisis going on. But also in things like automated comms, spoof AI systems, position engagement, and also disrupting behavior. So thinking about, accurately predicting behavior of humans and surveillance. I'm seeing data and privacy popping up all over the comments, which I totally agree with. So, these are some of the use cases that we're sort of seeing roll out across our portfolio in different verticals where you probably wouldn't consider it specifically AI. Yeah, sorry, I see a question here on censorship. I think that's a hairy one. But I think if you sort of just lean on what the tech world, pulling from Microsoft and their views about underscoring fairness, transparency, explainability, and human-centeredness, as well as privacy and security in the design and in the creation of I guess your guiding principles, and then building on some of like Google's language around creating new opportunities to improve the lives of people around the world. These are some of the things that we're seeing in terms of use cases roll out in, say, when we're investing in medtech and actually wondering how we can scale, or how can we try to think of that, automated targeting, or some of those tech applications and how they can be used to solve real life issues. And so I guess if I was to, summarize the thinking about, how do we translate this across, why it's so important to us in looking and assessing our investments, is because if you look at what the markets actually did in response to crisis, in response to I guess like some of these shocks that we've seen, from the financial crisis through to the pandemic, and then now with Russia and Ukraine, the markets have been quite resilient of late, which was sort of baffled all of the public markets investors. And so when we sort of looked and dived in, what we sort of decided, or I guess our thesis is that it's not so much a shock to the system now. We've actually learned to contain it. Governments have learned to build these systems to actually respond. And so now what we're seeing is it's very localized. So your assessment, your ESG screens, your ESG views, how you actually determine risk assessment and even opportunity is becoming actually very localized. And so I guess that's sort of how we're sort of seeing artificial intelligence roll out into the portfolio, and then how we sort of look at it from a perspective of, I guess, real applications within our day-to-day analysis.
That's great insight. Thank you, Vicky. I would like to also hear from Stefan from the GovLab perspective, if you can share us any of the use cases you've seen before.
Yeah, sure. And again, how much time do you have, Steve? Because obviously there's a lot happening in the space. And again, as it relates to use cases with regard to data sharing and data collaboratives, as some of you might know, anyway, one of our flagship initiatives is around data collaboratives. And we've done a lot of work on establishing data collaboratives and data sharing initiatives at the local level. And if you go to our website, datacollaboratives.org, you will find, anyway, probably the largest repository of examples. And especially what we have tried to do here is develop use cases where not only you share data within government, but actually provide access to privately held data for public interest purposes, right? Because I think Ian was referring to the elephant in the room. I think the big elephant in the room is actually the private sector, that has a lot of data, if not most data, that could be used if trust is available and if governance is well structured for other purposes, including public interest purposes. And again, COVID-19 has made that clear. And so I could, bore you to death with use cases there. But I think one particular kind of use case that I do want to emphasize is more of a use case around citizens' engagement, and where we actually do need a lot more experimentation on how we engage citizens around co-designing, as Christy was saying, co-designing the frameworks under which data is made accessible or AI is being used. What are the questions? What are the preferences? And so one use case that we've developed here in New York is around the data assembly, which is a citizens assembly that we established in order to solicit input on how you co-design the framework for accessing private and other data for responses to COVID-19. And so in New York City, they developed a data collaborative, a data partnership, and I was one of the advisors around access privately held data for COVID-19 recovery. But what we wanted to do is to make sure that we had the social license for doing so by actually engaging citizens in framing and in deciding what are the conditions. And typically, this discussion about are you for or against data sharing is quite often held in a binary way. Are you for or against? And it turns out that the public is far more sophisticated because their answer would be, well, it depends. And so what's then the process to determine what it is that depends? And I think that's where you need new deliberative mechanisms, such as citizens' assemblies, to really build scenarios. What would be your reaction if you would, if government would have access to cell phone data in order to make decisions with regard to social mobility policies, for instance, social constraining policies? What would be your response, and how would you feel about using complaints data that is being submitted to the city in order to govern the city? And it turns out that many, if not all, citizens have a pretty sophisticated approach to, well, I would be problematic, but not if it would be shared with this actor as opposed to another actor. And so it's really about developing the framework, as Ian was saying, about what is it, for what purpose, by whom, and under what conditions. And that requires a far more sophisticated process than just asking, are you for or against? And I think that's where we need a lot more experimentation. And that's also where the use cases, from my point of view, need to be increased.
Thanks, Stefan. And I'm sure that you can definitely have another hour sharing with us awesome use cases, and probably it needs its own session. But we are going to finally hear from Christy. It would be great to know if there was any use cases that SEER has been involved in.
Yeah, well, we really do listen to the questions that communities have, because once they have access to data, then to understand context or to determine how they should be measuring their impact, what they then have questions around are things like that really matter to them. For example, we want to make sure our kids are ready for school. So do we have enough supply of quality childcare and early education care to meet the needs of our community? And if not, where would we focus our efforts, and how would we make interventions for that? And so we've done a lot of work in AI systems and machine learning that answer these important questions around the supply and demand of essential services in the early education and care space, in healthcare. And we see that that's just going to continue to really explode and build on, because these are the things that matter to local people. And that's also what they're having, the ability to control, whether it be to improve and identify places that perhaps, there needs to be a higher quality or a stronger workforce pipelines, or investment in new systems or different policies. It enables the whole ecosystem, everybody who's working to get a better outcome for their communities and improve lives ultimately, ask those wicked questions and see if data science can help answer that. And I think that's the exciting domain and frontier that we're really working in partnership with communities and local people to understand their questions and how that can be answered with data science and AI.
Thank you, Christy, Stefan, Vicky, and Ian. That was awesome. We had a little bit of hiccup in the beginning, but I think we kind of recovered very quickly. I'm going to ask only one question from the audience because we kind of are over the time, and that would be for Ian. So Ian, would love to hear your thoughts about censorship.
Thanks, Steve, for the question. Censorship. So I guess it depends a little bit on what is meant by censorship. Censorship in the sense of restricting access to some people of some information is something which is actually part of what we're looking at with data sharing. It isn't the case that every data set is completely open. It isn't the case that every data set can go to everybody. So censorship in that sense is something which it is a way you could describe the limiting of access to information to those appropriate uses. The censorship more broadly is something which is a bigger societal issue, which I don't think is really a data question. I think it's more of a social norms question. And I think some of the conversations we've had today have really touched on the difference between the data part, the use of data, as in AI, as an example, and then the bigger societal questions about should we actually be doing this. And I was watching the chat just moments ago, looking at some of those bigger societal questions. And when we have been developing frameworks and thinking about how to use AI and thinking about appropriate use of data, we look at a problem, and if we've got some discomfort with it, we take away the AI bit and think, do we still have a problem with it? We take away the data bit and say, do we still have a problem with it? Then if we do, then it's what we're doing or the framework that we're thinking about this in, rather than the data bit and the AI bit. Now, that's not to say that we can't be concerned about the data bit and the AI bit, but we do try and separate out those different factors to try and find out where that discomfort actually lies. And one of the unintended consequences of all the scrutiny we've been putting on AI of late is that we expect a lot of explainability from AI. We expect a lot of transparency. But the side effect has been if we go through this exercise and we're still left with concern when we take the data and AI out, then we're actually now providing more scrutiny into what we're doing and how we're doing it, irrespective of whether there's AI or not. So there's actually been some side benefits about what can we do now that we can do things differently. Should we do this or should we do something slightly differently? So maybe not a direct answer to the question, but hopefully staying with the data part of that question.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I know that was a little bit of a curveball at the end, but great job. And kind of tying it in with the data and the data sharing. And that's a wrap up, everyone. Thank you very much, our awesome panelists, Stefan, Vicky, Ian, and Christy, and also our amazing audience, always helping us and supporting us through these running these events and panel discussions. BOAB AI will be running more events and various topics, so make sure you follow them on LinkedIn to be notified for the upcoming events. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.